This is the first of 3 videos on the Cold War, and this video is on the Cold War in Europe. The next one will be on Asia, and the last one will be Cold War at home in the United States. So a few things about the Cold War. Really, it's democracy versus communism. And there's a lot of differences between communism and democracy. Really, democracy, we're talking about the free exercise of expression, religion, freedom of the press. You can own private business. Whereas with communism, the government is going to own the farming, and the government is going to own the industry, and they're going to have their secret police make sure that you still believe in communism. So I guess in certain theories, certain scales, communism could work, but this is not communism. What they're doing is Soviet communism, which is really Leninism, which brings us to our leaders, right? So the leaders we're dealing with are Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, Winston Churchill. All right, and these are our leaders at the Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference is, they agreed on the formation of the United Nations, but it's really where they plan to reorganize Europe at the end of the war. And the 3 leaders agreed to allow free elections in the countries they liberated from the German rule. And Stalin even pledged to allow free elections in Poland after the war. See, this is kind of important because the Soviet communists kind of take over Eastern Europe and turn a lot of those governments into communist governments. So that's kind of getting problematic. That all clashes after FDR is out against these Eastern European governments, and what happens in Berlin in 1948 clashes against the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so the Truman Doctrine is going to be important. It is basically going to say that if you need protection against communism, against Stalin really, and it starts with Greece, we'll get to that in a second, that if you need protection and military aid, we'll give it to you as long as you're democratic. You believe in the free enterprise system and democracy. So when the communist rebels threaten Greece, and Stalin starts pressuring Turkey, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, steps in and says that we need to offer these countries aid. Okay, and he's doing this because he doesn't want to make the same mistake that they made in Munich. All right, in Munich in 1938, they didn't stand up to Hitler, and look what happened. So this is kind of a big deal. It puts everything to the test here. So what does happen with the rest of Europe? That's called the Marshall Plan. It's the reconstruction plan for Europe post World War II. This is happening in 1948, and it's run by the Secretary of State George C. Marshall. And this is just a massive amount of aid that are given to countries that are been broken up and destroyed by the war, and to rebuild their economies. We want the economies to be up and running because the success of our economy and the world, the global economy, depends on it. Okay, there's producers and markets in Europe that need to be up and running as soon as possible. So it's kind of a big deal. Also in 1948, I mentioned earlier the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift, I said, related to the Truman Doctrine, and here's how. So the Berlin Airlift. So this is a test. Berlin is occupied by the communists, by the Soviets. And so what happens, they think that the Allies are just going to abandon West Berlin. They say, you know what, Berlin's been divided, right? There's the wall, we got the Iron Curtain, and in the east you have communism, and in the west you have democracy, and it's just, we're not going to interact, and that's it. It's not going to work. The West brings in supplies by air, and that's the airlift. They lift supplies in and drop it into the occupied area of Berlin. And this shows the Soviets that the West is not going to back down. That whatever they do, the Allies and democracy are going to fight back. Okay, and we have the resources to do it. So it's a show that we're not going to retreat when we're faced with aggressive behavior from the Soviet Union. Now, about this Iron Curtain over here, there's a lot of friction. Okay, although the Americans kind of condemned the Soviet acts of force, the U.S. never directly intervenes behind that curtain. Soviet leaders are successful at suppressing anti-communist revolutions that break out, like in Hungary, for example, in 1956. They build the Berlin Wall in 1961 to prevent East Germans from escaping to the West, and they even invade Czechoslovakia in 1968 and overthrow the Czech reform government, all without active interference by the United States or its allies. So there is another side to all this, right? Which brings us into the next video on Asia, which we're going to focus on containment. Containment becomes an issue, especially in the 50s and 60s.